Hello, and welcome to Good Conversations. My name is Thompson Smith. We're honored to have with us today Caryn Miske, Executive Director of the Flathead Basin Commission based in Kalispell. Prior to her work with the FBC, Caryn worked as a land use attorney and as a private consultant for doing environmental and socio-economic impact analyses. She earned her BA in Public Affairs from the State University of New York in Albany, a Master's in Public Administration from Columbia University, and a law degree from the University of Montana. I should mention that in 2007, I was appointed to the Flathead Basin Commission as a citizen member from Lake County, so I've had the pleasure of serving on the commission and working with Caryn Miske for a couple of years now. Welcome, Caryn, and thanks for taking the time to be on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, let's start by talking a bit about the origins of the Flathead Basin Commission. What is the commission and how did it start?
The Flathead Basin Commission was created in 1983 by the state legislature, and it was created essentially to protect the waters flowing into and out of the Flathead Basin, as well as other natural resources, and to promote economic development. And that might seem like an oxymoron on the surface, but economic development is part of the mission as long as it does not impact water quality or other natural resources. So the goal of the Flathead Basin Commission is really to promote sustainable economic development. And the Basin Commission was created in large part due to threats north of the border in British Columbia. There was a proposed coal mine at that time in the 1980s, the Sage Creek, Cabin Creek coal mine, and it was a...
Let's just pause for a moment, just because some viewers may not be familiar with the geography of the Flathead Basin. And we're in the lower Flathead Basin here on the Flathead Reservation, the Flathead River that flows out of Flathead Lake. And flowing into Flathead Lake are three main branches of the Flathead River, isn't that correct?
Yes, North, Middle, and South Fork.
Okay, and the South Fork is to the east, coming out of the Bob Marshall. The Middle Fork kind of runs along the south end of Glacier National Park. And then, and the North Fork is really the river that's been of greatest concern for most of this time, hasn't it? And tell us about the North Fork.
It is. The North Fork would be impacted due to the position of the coal mines. As we were talking about geography, the Flathead Basin actually doesn't stop at our border. It goes across the border into British Columbia, and there's a piece of the Flathead Basin, actually, and the headwaters for the Flathead Basin is located in British Columbia. The original coal mine, the Cabin Creek coal mine, was located roughly 10 miles north of the border. That coal mine would have been basically draining directly into Glacier Park and into the North Fork.
I see. And so the North Fork originates in BC, runs for a number of miles through the kind of southeastern corner of British Columbia.
Yes. Without a map, I have to think about that, yes.
And then along the western boundary of Glacier National Park.
Yes.
Is that correct? And then down into the Flathead Valley near Kalispell, where it joins the other branches. And then they flow into Flathead Lake.
Correct.
So anything that would happen up the North Fork ends up in Flathead Lake.
It does, and it's interesting because as time has gone on over the last several decades and more research is being brought forward, the estimate of how long it would take, say, pollutants from the Cabin Creek coal mine to reach Flathead Lake, because it's a very fast-flowing system, would be about 72 hours.
72 hours.
So any of the contaminants on the BC side would be down here in about 3 days.
3 days. Okay. And the threat, of course, is both environmental, and you were mentioning that built into the mandate, the establishing legislation for the commission, was mention of concern over the economy.
Yes.
Why is that?
You know, it's interesting because I think often the economy and the environment are viewed as two separate things. But the reality is, especially again, as time has gone on in the Flathead Basin, if you look at it, the primary economic driver is no longer extractive industries, at least south of the border. And it is certainly no longer agriculture. It really is tourism. This is a tourism-based economy. People come here not to see museums and skyscrapers. They come here to enjoy the clean water, the pristine water, some of the most pristine water in the world. They come here to enjoy the fishery. They come here to enjoy our wildlife. The Flathead Basin boasts the largest complement of large and mid-sized carnivores anywhere in the lower 48. Only Alaska has more grizzly bears than we do right here. So we have an incredible resource. Aside from the mid and large-sized carnivores, this is also an area where 4 ecosystems essentially meet. And because of that, there's incredible biodiversity, especially biodiversity in vascular plants. Vascular plants being basically any plant that has a stem, so from a flower to a tree.
Which 4 ecosystems converge here?
Oh, now you're testing my science background, and I'm an attorney. I think it's an alpine, a prairie, the western, and I forget what it's called, but basically the warmer influence from coming out of the west, and then our Montana ecosystem. So forgive me for not knowing all the names.
We get the idea.
But yes, they all 4 converge here. And again, there's some scientific literature compiled and an inventory taken of all the vascular plants here. And the vascular plants in the Flathead Basin outstrip the number of vascular plants in the Serengeti.
Wow.
Yeah, we're talking incredible biodiversity here.
And it's also, it seems like it's unusual too in terms of the number of, or the proportion of plants and animals that are still here that have always been here, at least since the last ice age or something like that.
That's right. It's not much different here than when Lewis and Clark traveled this area. It's not much different, perhaps even, and this is going back a little bit further, but when the Salish and Kootenai tribes were living their traditional lifestyle across this landscape unfettered. So I think again, it's very unique. If you look at most other places in the United States, you don't have a natural ecosystem, or if you do, you have very small fragments of it left. And here you have a large-scale functioning ecosystem on a landscape level, which is pretty incredible.
And you mentioned the tribes. This is also, of course, within the territories that the tribes ceded in the Hellgate Treaty, as well as the reservation itself is part of the basin. So it's of special importance to the tribes.
It is. The Salish and Kootenai have a reservation down here with set treaty rights. So again, when we talk about a coal mine 10 miles north of the border, with pollution coming down the North Fork of the Flathead River and winding up in Flathead Lake, the implications in terms of treaty rights are potentially significant.
Not only on the reservation, but there are treaty rights off the reservation too, correct?
That is correct, yes, absolutely. And Salish and Kootenai have a sister band, the Tanaha, which also have traditional territory in this part of the Flathead. The Tanaha, they're in a little bit of a different situation because they do not have set treaty rights. They're currently in negotiations with the BC government.
I see.
So they don't have the same set of rights that the Salish Kootenai have, but nonetheless, that is their traditional land.
Okay. And then touching a bit more on the resource itself, the jewel at the center of this whole thing is Flathead Lake.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about the resource of Flathead Lake itself.
Flathead Lake is the largest lake west of the Mississippi, one of the most pristine, clean, clear water, probably in the world.
As far as large lakes.
As far as large lakes, yes. The Flathead Lake Biological Station studies lakes around the world, and they hold up Flathead Lake as one of the most incredible resources in terms of its water purity, its clarity. There are a lot of other lakes around the country, but they don't have the same clarity, or they have other issues. A lot of lakes are now invaded with exotic species, quagga mussel, zebra mussel. So the fact that this pristine lake exists, in spite of quite a bit of development, is actually quite an accomplishment for both the tribe and the state.
And there has been degradation of the lake's water quality over the last century or more.
There has
correct?
been, and that's been tracked pretty extensively since the 1970s. And if you look at the long-term trends, and there are blips within there, so it's not a year-by-year trend, but if you look at the 30-year trend roughly, water quality has pretty consistently declined. And that's due in large part to nitrogen, phosphorus. Those are the two of the key components.
What's the source of those pollutants, the primary sources?
The primary source of nitrogen is almost everything we do, from fertilizing our yards to cow poop. I mean, pretty much everything that we do, humans
Septic
do.
systems?
Septic systems has an impact in terms of nitrogen loading. Phosphorus is now being more controlled because there is a phosphorus ban. So I'll say on detergents. But again, you can get phosphorus in other forms. I mean, fertilizers being one. So phosphorus content has overall probably declined, but not to the point where it's completely off the table. But nitrogen is the primary concern, and the state is working on that to establish a TMDL to establish allocation loads for that.
TMDL.
Oh, sorry, total maximum daily load. And essentially what that does, let's say for nitrogen,
Let's start with what that essentially is before what it does. Total maximum daily load means how much nitrogen is allowed per day to go into a given body of water, is that right?
It could be nitrogen or it could be anything. So it could be nitrogen, it could be phosphorus, it could be sediment. You even have TMDLs now for temperature. To regulate temperature. So yes, you're trying to basically, first and foremost, you measure what's there now, and then you measure and then you try to model what's an acceptable amount, and perhaps, depending on your water body, in the case of Flathead Lake, how much you need to reduce that nitrogen. And then you basically allocate different reductions to different folks. So right now, DEQ is at the stage of essentially monitoring what's there and modeling what's there for the allocation.
I see. And so there have been all these pollutants going into the basin over the last 100 years, mostly from the U.S. side. Is that correct?
Yes, mostly from the U.S. side. I mean, the majority of the pollutants at this point have come from developments on our side of the border, and in large part are really from non-point source pollution, and I can explain that. I mean, what I mean by that is not coming out of a pipe. For many,
so this would be like agricultural lands, the runoff from
the runoff from
fertilizing.
agricultural lands, but equally important, the runoff from subdivisions. One thing that subdivisions what happens with subdivisions is you have a lot more impervious surface. You have roads, you have driveways, you have even roofs. All of that impervious surface now can't absorb water. So what happens is you increase the quantity of runoff and you increase the velocity of the runoff. So you have a lot more runoff going into the river, and much of that runoff is contaminated with nitrogen.
I see.
So you don't have the same ability to, I mean, you know, before you had this number of subdivisions, a lot of that would have just been absorbed into the ground and not gone into the river.
I see, I see. And you said non-point source pollutions. The main point source pollution, I imagine, is the city of Kalispell upriver. Is that correct?
It was, and for a long time it was a pretty significant source of pollution. Actually, the Kalispell sewage treatment plant is a success story. It has dramatically reduced the amount of nitrogen coming out of at the tail end at the point source. And really at this point it's ratcheted down its nitrogen to the point where you can't ratchet it down much more. They're doing a pretty fantastic job of it. So we have to start looking more and more at non-point sources if we want to get a handle on the amount of nitrogen going into the lake. And you know, I think it's a fair question to say, well, what's the big deal? The water quality is still clear, the water quality is still pristine. That's true, but if you track things like primary production and algae blooms are increasing, including toxic algae blooms. So if you're looking at the role of nitrogen and its correlation with algae blooms, yes, the lake is still clean, but there are signs that it's not all well. So the time to address it is now,
If we want to save this,
if we want to
for
save this,
future
right?
generations.
Before you really have a problem. I mean, if you look at other lakes where they have significant problems, like Lake Tahoe, sometimes you have to take extremely draconian measures to save a lake.
Yeah.
If you had just acted in advance, you could probably take, far less draconian measures and still get the same result. It's just a matter of, are you going to act pre-pollution or post-pollution?
Right. And
So-
Montana has a long history of trying to learn that lesson. The Clark Fork and the pollution from Anaconda and Butte being a good example. It's costing millions of dollars now to try to fix that problem.
It is. SARCO is spending millions, and in the end, there is a lot of cleanup that has gone on, but some of it, honestly, they don't know what to do. I mean, they don't know what to do with the Berkeley pit. And I think that's a big question for a lot of folks. So yes, you can spend a lot of money on the ground to clean things up, and many things can be cleaned up, but there are some things that can't be fixed so readily, even if you throw a lot of money at it.
Yes. Okay, well, we're going to take just a 1-minute break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Again, we're talking today with Caryn Miske, Executive Director of the Flathead Basin Commission. Thanks again, Caryn, for being here.
Great to be here.
Before the break, we had a good discussion about the resource itself of the Flathead Basin and its importance, its value environmentally, economically. One thing that I thought we could mention in summary there is that Glacier National Park and Waterton and this area right on the east edge of the headwaters of the Flathead Basin were declared a World Heritage Site some years ago. That's a very rare designation, isn't it?
It is. It was declared a World Heritage Site. It was also declared by the United Nations an International Biosphere Reserve. Both pretty rare designations, and it just goes to demonstrate the unique attributes of this area.
Okay, and we also touched a bit on the establishing legislation in 1983 that established the Flathead Basin Commission, passed by the Montana legislature. And the commission is a broad-based group that doesn't really describe it. It's not really a regulatory thing. What is it exactly?
It actually has no regulatory authority under statute. It is a cooperative organization, really, of folks from many of the management agencies in the basin, as well as citizen members. So, for example, there's a representative from DNRC, there's a representative from DEQ, there's a representative from the Salish and Kootenai tribe, there's a representative from British Columbia, and there are a total, and I'm not going to name them all because we could run through the rest of the program, of 23 members right now. 23,
yeah. And it also spans the political landscape as well. People who would adhere more to the Democratic side of things and people who would adhere more to the Republican side. Is that?
That is absolutely correct. It is a bipartisan organization. We have folks who are publicly very active in the Republican Party. We have also folks that are active in the Democratic Party. So we want to work with people from both sides of the aisle, because ultimately clean water is not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. Clean water is an issue for everybody. Everyone wants to drink clean water. Everyone wants their children to have clean water. So this is an issue that has garnered and continues to garner broad support. The Flathead delegation, which is pretty conservative, has given us a lot of support in the legislature, even in this past legislative session, which was pretty contentious.
Sure.
And it goes to show, I think, the value of what's here, and that I think almost everybody, hands down, can say, we want clean water, we want to keep our clean water.
Yeah. And when the basin was established, it also had this relatively little-known treaty to draw upon in trying to exercise its influence to protect the basin. Can you describe that treaty? What is it?
The Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 was created essentially to make sure that both countries were not in a position where they would pollute each other's water. That means that Canada can't pollute water that's coming to our side of the border, and we cannot pollute water that goes to the other side of the border.
It was just a treaty between the U.S. and Canada.
It was, yes. Yes.
And how does it work? How is it enforced? How does it?
That's a good question. There's a lot of question about how it can be enforced and whether that would be enforced. One way in which the Boundary Waters Treaty comes into effect is by invocation to the International Joint Commission. And that was actually done in the 1980s when the Cabin Creek coal mine was being proposed. And the International Joint Commission, after convening 50 scientists, 25 from both sides of the border, and after several years of study, concluded that the Cabin Creek mine should not be permitted. And essentially for a couple of reasons. The IJC thought there would likely be impacts. It was likely that those impacts couldn't be mitigated, and that you couldn't take risks that were unacceptable to either country. So as long as the United States and Montana had concerns about the potential of contamination, essentially the IJC recommended that Cabin Creek coal mine should not be permitted. The IJC also recommended, and this is something that the state of Montana and the Flathead Basin has tried to do ever since its creation, is to work with British Columbia to develop a win-win solution that everyone could be happy with and that would protect the Flathead Basin for current and future generations. Unfortunately, BC has not been, for the most part, has not really been willing to discuss that part of the IJC recommendation.
I see. Was the IJC, the International Joint Commission, which is this Canadian-U.S. joint commission that was really established by the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, their recommendation to deny the Cabin Creek mine in the 1980s, was that what stopped the mine?
That's a question that's up for debate. The Cabin Creek coal mine was owned by the Sage Creek Coal Company Limited, I believe. And what happened is shortly after the IJC made its recommendation, Sage Creek pulled out. And it wasn't clear whether that was due to the IJC recommendation per se, or whether that was due to dropping coal prices, and I don't think that can be determined definitively. What BC has said from the time of the IJC recommendation up until the present is that they do not recognize the IJC's or they do not interpret the IJC recommendation in the same way we do. The language is very clear, but BC has never been willing to submit to the recommendation, and they've repeatedly said to the state of Montana that the recommendation is not binding upon them. So
the Sage Creek withdrew after the IJC ruling, but we don't know if it was because of the IJC ruling.
No, we don't.
In a sense, this treaty and the International Joint Commission has never really been put to the test, where they've said no, and either the US or Canada has said, no, we want to continue with this project, we're going to do it anyway. It's never really come to that kind of head.
No, it has not come to that point. Richard Paisley, who's a professor of law in BC, maintains pretty strongly that if BC were to go forward with some of the proposals that have been on the table in the last couple of years, they would in fact be violating international law. What that would actually look like and how that would actually be pursued legally, I think there is still some question about that. That being said, though, there's also a recent court decision which I think puts a little finer point on it, which is the Lake Roosevelt decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And under that ruling, the court held essentially that if a company, even if it's a Canadian company, pollutes waters which then flow into Montana, that company can be found liable and be forced to pay damages. And in the case of Lake Roosevelt, that's exactly what happened. A Canadian company, Tech Kamenko, was sued under CERCLA, and the damages were awarded. So if BP or Klein Mine or anybody else decided that they might like to develop in the Flathead, the Lake Roosevelt decision certainly, I think, should give them pause, because the minute the pollution starts traveling downstream, essentially, there's always that question about, would there be liability?
We don't really
CERCLA?
want to wait till the pollution is rolling downstream.
No, we don't. But I do think it's something that Canadian companies now have to contend with and look at.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have a minute or two left here. I'm glad to say you're going to be coming back for another half hour. So next week, Caryn will be with us again to continue this discussion. But in the last minute we have, last 30 seconds, can you just, as a teaser, say what the threat is today to the basin? Why are people really concerned?
The threat today is coal bed methane development and mountaintop removal coal mining in the BC portion of the Flathead drainage.
Okay, so we'll get back to that in our next half hour. These two gigantic proposals, really,
Yes.
Dwarfing the proposals of the 1980s.
Absolutely.
So that's the current concern. We'll be back next week to continue this conversation with Caryn Miske, Executive Director of the Flathead Basin Commission. Thanks for watching. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for the program, please email us at goodtalk@blackfoot.net. Thanks again for being with us and watching. We'll see you next week. So long.